Listen, old man. Officer Mark Olson's voice growled, full of contempt, the sound cutting like a knife through the chilly evening air. You can be a living saint or a former president. I don't care. To me, you're just another old black guy hanging around the neighborhood. And if you don't shut up and do as I say, you're going to be spending the night in a cell. Got it? Olson had no idea that, just hours later, his own words and actions, recorded in minute detail by an invisible witness, would be used as a powerful testimony in an internal hearing, ending the police career he had once prided himself on and viewed as a symbol of his personal power. Nor could he have imagined that the old black man with the shabby clothes and rickety cart would be the man to whom the city's most talented and famous young lawyer, who would represent him in a few hours, would bow respectfully and call him teacher. At that moment, in the drunkenness of petty power, Olson saw only an easy target to bully, a puppet on which to vent the unwarranted frustrations of a long, tiring, and boring day. The afternoon slowly descended on the city, painting the tall buildings gray and the streets starting to empty. The wind blew in gusts, carrying the bitter cold of the dying autumn, causing the last leaves on the branches to tremble and fall, spinning in the air before landing on the cold asphalt. Solomon Washington, 70 years old, pulled the collar of his thin, worn coat up a little higher, trying to shield his thin body from the cold wind. His back was slightly bent by the years and the burdens of life, but each of his steps, though slow, still contained a certain steadiness. His silver-white hair was neatly trimmed, contrasting with his dark skin and gentle eyes, although now slightly tired after a long day. He was pushing a small wheelbarrow, its wheels squeaking steadily along the sidewalk, filled with the fruits of an afternoon's work, a few plastic bottles, some empty cardboard boxes, and some old newspapers. It was a way for him to supplement his meager pension and a way to exercise and keep his mind busy, away from the sad memories that occasionally flooded back. Solomon lived alone in a small, modest apartment in a shabby neighborhood where colorful graffiti alternated with peeling walls. Today, he took a familiar shortcut home, one that led through a more affluent neighborhood of manicured mansions and expensive cars parked silently in their yards. He had no intention of doing anything more than shortening the distance, but the contrast between his appearance, his old cart, and the upscaleness of the neighborhood had drawn unwanted attention. Officer Mark Olson, 30, was on his afternoon patrol. His police car slid slowly down the street, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Olson was a tall, muscular man, his face permanently fixed in a scowl, impatient. He had joined the police force believing he would bring order, but over time that belief had warped into a cockiness that gave him the right to judge and punish anyone he deemed out of line. Olson had a deep but implicit bias against people of color and those he considered to be underclass. They were always potential suspects. As Olson's patrol car turned onto the street Solomon was on, the sight of an elderly, shabbily dressed black man pushing a cart full of what Olson considered trash in a posh neighborhood immediately triggered every stereotype in his head. A thought flashed through his mind. What is this old man doing here? He must be up to no good. Olson pressed the accelerator lightly, and the police car slowly approached and stopped right next to Solomon, blocking his way. He rolled down the window, his voice curt, without the slightest bit of politeness. "Hey, man, stop!" Solomon stopped, startled. He looked toward the car, squinting through the headlights that had begun to come on as the sky darkened. He didn't understand what was happening. Olson opened the door and stepped out with authority. His tall frame cast a shadow over Solomon. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice suspicious. his hand resting on the holstered gun at his hip in a threatening habit. "What's in that cart? Stolen?" Solomon looked the young officer straight in the eye. His eyes, though tired, were surprisingly calm. "Officer," he replied, his voice soft but clear, without a trace of tremor. "I'm just on my way home. These are things I picked up, nothing stolen." Olson smirked, a smile that was not meant to be funny. "On your way home? What slum do you live in that you pass through here?" He stepped closer, shining a flashlight directly into Solomon's face, making him squint. The bright light made him uncomfortable, but he didn't flinch. "Show me your ID, and open that car so I can inspect it." "Officer, may I know why you want to be inspected?" Solomon asked, keeping his voice even. He knew his rights, but he also knew that in situations like this, insisting on them too forcefully sometimes only made matters worse. Solomon's question seemed to strike a chord in Olson's ego. The irritation on his face grew more evident. "Reason? I'm a cop. I have the right to check anyone, anything suspicious. And you, in this state, in this neighborhood, at this hour, are extremely suspicious." He emphasized each word, his voice defiant. "I don't need a reason to talk to someone like you. This is no place for a scavenger. Or are you spying on a house to steal at night?" Solomon sighed. He didn't want to argue. He slowly took an old wallet from his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled identification card. "Here are my papers. Officer." Olson snatched the card, glanced at it, and then shoved it roughly back into Solomon's hand. "Solomon Washington," he said, his voice mocking. "That's a great name. Now open your wrecked car." Solomon said nothing more, quietly opening the makeshift tarp over the cart. Inside were a few empty plastic bottles, some old newspapers, and a few neatly stacked cardboard boxes. Olson poked at the pile with the end of his baton, stirring it up. He found nothing out of the ordinary, but frustration was evident on his face, as if he were hoping to find something that would give him an excuse to arrest Solomon. "Is that all?" Olson asked, his voice still filled with doubt. "Or did you stash the stolen goods somewhere?" "Officer, I told you, I didn't steal anything," Solomon repeated patiently. Solomon's calmness infuriated Olson even more. He felt disrespected, as if the old man had no fear of his authority. In a fit of rage, Olson kicked Solomon's cartwheel. The cart lurched and toppled to one side. Plastic bottles and cardboard boxes were strewn across the sidewalk, some of them glass, shattering with a deafening clang. "Oh, sorry," Olson said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, his lips curling into a smirk. "Maybe you weren't careful, or maybe this rickety car of yours is destined for the landfill, just like its owner." Solomon looked at his broken belongings, then back at the policeman. For a moment, a deep sadness flashed in his eyes, but it was quickly overshadowed by a quiet determination. He said nothing, no reproach or complaint. He simply bent down and began to pick up what was left, careful to avoid the broken glass. His silence, his almost supernatural patience, seemed a greater challenge than any protest. It made Olson feel uncomfortable, as if an invisible wall was blocking his every attempt to humiliate the man. Not far away, on the other side of the street, a silver car had just stopped. Amelia Hayes, a young lawyer in her 30s, with dark brown hair tied back in a neat bun and intelligent, sharp eyes, was on her way home from a stressful day at her prestigious law firm. She happened to witness the whole thing from the moment Officer Olson started yelling at Solomon until he deliberately knocked over the cart. At first, she was just outraged by the seemingly abusive behavior of the police officer, but as she looked more closely at the older man being treated unfairly, a vague sense of familiarity rose within her. Despite his changed appearance, with his white hair, thinner build and work clothes, there was something about his demeanor, his extraordinary composure, that made her pause. Amelia did not immediately recognize him as Professor Solomon Washington, the respected teacher she had admired and deeply indebted to since her college years. Professor Washington, with his passionate lectures on civil rights history and the U.S. Constitution, had inspired her to pursue law and fight for justice. She remembered the image of him standing at the podium, his eloquent voice, his profound knowledge, and his dedication to his students. She had never imagined that she would see him again under such circumstances. But at this point, her lawyer instincts kicked in. She realized the officer was becoming increasingly aggressive and that the situation could escalate if she intervened unwisely. Instead of confronting him directly, Amelia quietly took out her phone, turned on video mode, and tried to capture the entire incident as clearly as possible. From Officer Olson's words to his actions, she knew that evidence was the most powerful weapon in a legal battle. Olson, unaware that he was being filmed, grew increasingly impatient with what he perceived as Solomon's stubborn silence. "Old man, you think you can get away with this by just keeping quiet?" he growled. "You're resisting a law enforcement officer. Do you know that? I can arrest you on the spot for disturbing public order and being uncooperative." Solomon raised his head, his eyes looking straight at Olson, without a trace of fear. "Officer, I'm not causing trouble, nor am I resisting. I just want to go home." "Home?" Olson smiled wickedly. "Fine. I'll send you home. Your home tonight will be a cell at the police station. Let's see if you can still keep your mouth shut." With that, Olson grabbed Solomon's skinny arm, twisted it behind his back, and pulled a pair of shiny handcuffs from his belt. Slap! The cold metal clamped down on Solomon's wrist. He winced in pain, but did not cry out or protest. He knew that any resistance was futile, and would only make things worse. "You have the right to remain silent." Olson recited the Miranda rights, his voice still thick with malice. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Solomon listened, feeling a pang of bitterness. He, a professor who had spent his life studying and teaching about the Constitution and civil liberties, was now hearing those rights read out by a police officer who was blatantly violating them. The irony of life was sometimes cruel. Olson pushed Solomon toward the patrol car, opened the back door, and roughly shoved him inside. The cart and the wreckage of bottles were left on the sidewalk as silent testimony to the injustice that had just occurred. Amelia Hayes, across the street, continued filming until the squad car carrying Solomon was out of sight. She hung up immediately, anger and concern written all over her face. She zoomed in on the video, studied the older man's face, and then her heart skipped a beat. There was no mistaking it. No matter how much time and adversity had changed his appearance, she recognized that look, that high, intelligent forehead. It was Professor Solomon Washington. A feeling of shock and anger welled up inside Amelia. The teacher she respected, a learned scholar, a kind man, was being treated like a criminal just because of his appearance and current circumstances. She couldn't let this continue. She remembered many years ago when she graduated with honors. Professor Washington had slipped her a business card with his personal phone number in his hand, saying, "Amelia, if you need any help in the future, don't hesitate to call me. I always believe in your talent and integrity." She had never dared to bother him. But now, he was the one who needed her help. Meanwhile, at the local police station, Officer Olson gleefully ushered Solomon into the duty room. He pushed Solomon into a hard plastic chair, then began filling out paperwork with apparent smugness. He recounted the incident to his duty colleagues, embellishing the details to paint his brave act as arresting a suspicious individual who was loitering in a wealthy neighborhood with nefarious intentions. Solomon sat silently, taking in his surroundings. The stale air of the police station, the pungent smell of disinfectant, the crackling of walkie-talkies, the cold faces of the officers. He had been to police stations before, but as a researcher, an expert invited to give lectures on the law, not as a handcuffed suspect. "Hey, old man." Olson turned, tossing an old landline phone at Solomon. "By rule, you get one call. Who's it? Make it quick? Your gang? Or your old wife at home waiting?" He laughed, thinking he was being funny. Solomon paid no attention to the taunts. He picked up the receiver, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed a number he knew by heart, though he had never used it. It was Amelia Hayes's phone number. On the other end of the line, Amelia was watching the video, her heart boiling. The phone rang, startling her. It was an unknown number. She intended to ignore it, but a hunch told her. "Hello, Amelia Hayes," she answered, her voice professional. "Amelia, it's me, Solomon Washington." Professor Washington's weak, tired, yet still calm voice rang out from the other end of the line. Amelia stood up abruptly, her office chair nearly toppling over. "Sir, where are you? Are you okay?" She tried to keep her voice from shaking with emotion and worry. "I'm at the West Precinct Police Station. They arrested me for disturbing the peace," Solomon said, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "I'll be there," Amelia said firmly. "Don't say anything more. Don't sign any papers. I'll be there right away." Amelia didn't waste a second hanging up. She grabbed her briefcase and jacket and stormed out of the office. Her plan was clear in her mind. She would not only free her teacher, but she would make whoever did this pay. Less than 20 minutes later, Amelia Hayes arrived at the West Precinct Police Station. She walked in with the confident, professional demeanor of a seasoned attorney. Her well-fitted navy blue business suit, her hair pulled back in a bun, and her determined gaze made several of the officers sitting around chatting look up. She headed straight for the reception desk, where Officer Olson was still scribbling notes. "I'm Amelia Hayes, attorney," she said, her voice clear and sharp. "I'm here to see my client, Mr. Solomon Washington, who you just arrested." Olson raised his head and looked Amelia up and down with a scrutinizing look. He didn't expect the old man to be able to call a lawyer, and a young, beautiful, and respectable one at that. However, his inherent arrogance still made him look down on her. "Oh, a lawyer? That's fast. He probably specializes in these petty cases, right?" He smiled faintly. "Your client is in there, but I'm afraid he'll have to stay here for a while. The charges of rebellion and disorder are not light." Amelia ignored Olson's attitude. "I demand to see my client immediately, and I also want the name and badge number of the officer who made this arrest." Olson shrugged. "Officer Mark Olson, badge number 714. That's me. What's the matter?" "Attorney." "There are many problems, Officer Olson," Amelia replied, her voice icy. "First, I request to see your commanding officer." Amelia's confidence and uncompromising attitude made Olson start to feel a little uneasy. He wasn't used to being questioned like that by a young woman. Still, he tried to keep up a tough front. "My commander is busy. Tell me what you have to say." "I'll wait," Amelia said firmly, folding her arms across her chest. "And while you're waiting, I suggest you review your arrest procedures, Officer Olson, because what you did to Mr. Solomon Washington this afternoon may be something you'll regret very much." Amelia's demeanor, along with the formality with which she mentioned Professor Washington's name, caught the attention of an older officer sitting nearby. He approached and asked about the situation. After hearing Amelia's brief explanation, his expression became serious. He recognized the name Amelia Hayes, one of the city's most prominent young lawyers, specializing in civil and human rights cases. He hurried inside, probably to report to his superiors. A short time later, Captain Miller, the commander of the Western Precinct Police Station, stepped out. He was a middle-aged man, about 50, with a stocky build, a stern face, but a look of fairness and experience in his eyes. "Hello, Miss Hayes," Captain Miller said, his voice calm. "I'm Captain Miller. My officer reports that you have some complaints about the arrest of Mr. Solomon Washington." "Hello, Captain," Amelia replied, extending her hand to shake Miller's. "That's right. I'm here as Mr. Washington's attorney, and I have to say, I'm appalled by the way Officer Olson treated my client." Amelia began to recount the events in a clear, logical manner, from Officer Olson's unjustified stoppage of Mr. Solomon, the insults, the arbitrary search, the intentional tipping over of the cart, and finally his arrest on unfounded charges. As she spoke, she discreetly played back the video on her phone, loud enough for Captain Miller to hear Olson's words and demeanor. Officer Olson, standing nearby, began to change color. He had not expected that what had seemed like a harmless encounter would lead to this situation. He tried to interject. "Captain, what she said is not true. That old man is very suspicious, and he is showing an antagonistic attitude." "Officer Olson, be quiet," Captain Miller interrupted, his voice stern. He turned to Amelia. "Miss Hayes, do you have any proof of your words?" "Yes, Captain," Amelia said, holding up her phone. "I recorded a significant portion of the incident, and I believe Officer Olson's body camera will confirm what I'm saying." Captain Miller looked at Officer Olson with a questioning gaze. Olson kept his head down, not daring to look straight. He knew his dash cam was recording, and he also knew that what it recorded would not be beneficial to him. But that wasn't all. Amelia took a deep breath, preparing to deliver the final blow. "Captain Miller," she said, her voice growing serious, "what Officer Olson, and perhaps you don't know, is that the man Officer Olson just arrested and brutalized was not just an innocent senior citizen. He was Professor Solomon Washington." Hearing the name Professor Solomon Washington, Captain Miller paused. His expression changed to one of surprise, then doubt. "Professor Solomon Washington? You mean historian, expert on the Constitution?" "That's him," Amelia insisted. "One of the country's foremost scholars of civil rights and constitutional history, a man who has devoted his life to studying and teaching about justice, about human rights. What Officer Olson did today was not only a personal affront to a respected man, a symbol of wisdom and dignity, but also an affront to the very principles that your police profession is sworn to protect." Silence fell over the room. Captain Miller stared at Amelia, then turned to Officer Olson, whose face was as white as a sheet. Olson stammered, his voice trembling. "No, it can't be. It's just an old rag picker, dressed in rags." He couldn't believe his ears. The image of the old, gaunt man in his shabby clothes, whom he had despised and abused, now appeared with a different aura, an aura of erudition and respectability that he could never reach. Captain Miller, who had read some of Professor Washington's work and greatly admired his intellect, felt a surge of shame and anger. He could not believe that an officer under his command could behave so foolishly and unprofessionally. He signaled for another officer to bring Solomon Washington out of the holding room. As Solomon stepped out, still in his old work clothes, but looking somewhat calmer, Captain Miller approached, his voice full of remorse. "Professor Washington, this is Captain Miller, the commanding officer of this post. I don't know what else to say except our most sincere apologies for Officer Olson's unacceptable behavior. Please forgive me." Solomon looked at Captain Miller, then at Officer Olson, who stood with his head bowed, his whole body shaking. He nodded slightly. "Captain, I accept your apology." Amelia Hayes stepped up to her teacher. "Captain Miller, we demand that Officer Olson be dealt with to the fullest extent of the law and of the department. His actions were not only an abuse of power, but also clearly discriminatory." "Absolutely, Ms. Hayes," Captain Miller confirmed. "We will launch an immediate internal investigation. Officer Olson will be placed on administrative leave pending this investigation. Your video and Officer Olson's dash cam footage will be critical evidence." Officer Mark Olson felt as if the sky was falling from under his feet. The career he had once been proud of, the position he had used to show off to others, was now gone because of a moment of stupidity, because of his own blind prejudice. He raised his head and looked at Professor Washington, the man he had treated so cruelly. The old professor's eyes contained neither gloating nor contempt, only a deep sadness and a strange sympathy. That made Olson feel even more ashamed and guilty. "Sir," Olson stammered, his voice choking. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I'm so sorry." Those were the hardest words Olson had ever had to say in her life. Solomon looked at Olson, a long, deep look. "Young man," he said, his voice low and warm, "repentance is the first step. But more importantly, you need to understand that your mistake was not just that you mistreated me, a person who happened to have a past you did not know about. Your mistake was that you allowed prejudices about a person's skin color, appearance, or circumstances to cloud the fair judgment and compassion required of a law enforcement officer. Hopefully, this will be a valuable lesson for you." Captain Miller ordered another officer to take Officer Olson back to his office, pending a decision. Then he turned back to Solomon and Amelia. "Again, Professor, I am deeply sorry. We will arrange for a ride home. And rest assured, we will handle this matter in the most fair and thorough manner." He also offered to pay for Solomon's broken cart and other minor damages. Solomon simply shook his head. "Captain, I don't want any compensation, other than justice being served. What I want is for no one else to have to go through what I went through today, just because they look different or unfit in someone's eyes." Officer Olson's case was investigated quickly. Amelia's video, along with Professor Washington's testimony and Olson's dash cam data, provided ample evidence of his egregious abuse of power, discrimination, and disrespect. Not only that, the investigation also uncovered several previous similar cases where Olson had been fortunate to escape due to lack of evidence or victims being afraid to speak up. The end result was not unexpected. Mark Olson was fired from the police force. He lost his job, his reputation, and the self-respect he once had. His case, although not widely publicized in the media at the request of Professor Washington, who did not want to be the center of attention, was reported internally as a stern warning about police attitudes and responsibilities. Olson was also required to write a formal letter of apology to Professor Washington, a symbolic act, but also part of the process of making amends. A few days later, Amelia Hayes visited Professor Washington at his small apartment. She brought some fruit, some new history books that she knew he would enjoy, and a new handcart, sturdier than the old one that Olson had ruined. Solomon greeted her with a gentle smile. His room was small but neat and clean. Books were everywhere, on the shelves, on the table, even neatly stacked on the floor. The afternoon sunlight shone through the window, illuminating the old pages, creating a peaceful, quiet atmosphere. "Thank you, Amelia," Solomon said, taking the fruit basket and the books. "You didn't have to do that." "The cart, too." "It was the least I could do, sir," Amelia replied, still feeling a little guilty for putting her teacher through such an unpleasant experience. "I still feel guilty for not recognizing you sooner and intervening." Solomon waved his hand. "Don't blame yourself. Amelia, you did well. You acted as a professional lawyer and a caring student. What matters is that the truth was told and justice was served, even if only to some extent." They sat down and talked about books, about social changes, and about the recent incident. What's sad is not how he treated a retired professor or someone with some reputation, Solomon said thoughtfully, looking out the window. It's how he, and probably many others, are willing to treat a human being they consider inferior, based on their appearance, skin color, or circumstances. Anyone, no matter who they are, what they do, where they come from, deserves to be treated as a human being. Hopefully that young officer and others will learn something from this. A lesson in humility, in looking beyond superficial prejudices. Amelia nodded, her heart filled with emotion. "Sir, you always taught us about human dignity, about the importance of standing up for the weak. I believe that justice, no matter how slow or difficult it may seem at times, will always be the beacon we must strive for." Solomon smiled. "You're right, Amelia. And as long as there are people like you, willing to fight for what's right, I have faith in the future." The story of Professor Solomon Washington and Officer Mark Olson ends, not with a satisfying revenge, but with a quiet but profound awakening. It is a reminder that a person's true worth lies not in their outward appearance, nor in their social status or the wealth they possess. It lies in the depth of their soul, in the depth of their intellect, and in their inalienable dignity. Discrimination based on superficial prejudices is a poison that slowly destroys trust, empathy, and community cohesion. Only when we learn to see and respect the true value of each individual beyond the barriers of appearance will society truly become more civilized and just. And sometimes, the most important lessons come from the humblest people, in the most unexpected circumstances.